Well, all right. Welcome back to As It Should Be. Paul Bertolino here, and I decided I wanted to do a different kind of video this time. I didn't want to do another track versus track or another ranking the albums, and doing an album focus, takes a bit of prep that I didn't feel like doing. And anyway, I decided I was going to do. I decided I wanted to do a video where I talk about the early albums, my early albums, like my earliest albums of my childhood, because I got into music very early. I mean, my earliest memories, I loved music and I was really obsessed with records, and that's thanks really to the exposure to records and the music that I had almost right from the get-go, because my family, there were a lot of young people in my family. My parents were really young, and I had a lot of aunts and uncles who were very young, who were in junior high, high school, and or younger in some cases, and there were lots of records around. And so I mean, really, honestly, truly, my earliest memories of life, I was really into music and records. And it was, my dad's side of the family, the Bertolino family, my grandma and grandpa Bertolino, they had 6 kids. You know, they were like the Italian Brady Bunch, and most of the kids were older and out of the house by the time I was around. But the 2 youngest kids, my Aunt Vivian and my Uncle Dino, were still in the house, and they had records. And some of the records that they had were theirs, but then other ones I think had just kind of been in the house, and there were certain records that seemed sort of like community records that just sort of had been there, and they may have been. Maybe they were hand-me-downs from older brothers, older sisters. My older aunts and uncles who were no longer in the house, they probably left certain records behind. And, in the very first record that I ever really remember loving, being obsessed with, I mean, the record really that I can honestly say probably introduced me to music and to records and just to the whole thing, is the Beatles' second album. They had a mono copy of the Beatles' second album in the house at Grandma and Grandpa Bertolino's, and that is definitely one of those records where I never really knew exactly who it actually belonged to, like who had bought it initially, who had brought it into the house. Maybe my Aunt Jenny. Who knows? I'm not sure. All I know is that by the time I was around, and I was at Grandma and Grandpa's a lot, that record was just there, and I fell in love with it. I mean, I'm seriously talking like 3 years old. I was listening to this record, and of course, "She Loves You" was my very favorite song. But and I loved the whole record. I mean, I used to stare at the cover and look at all the pictures of them, and I kind of understood that Paul McCartney, the guy who was in Wings, was one of those guys, but I wasn't fully putting 2 and 2 together. I just sort of kind of understood that. It all looks so different. And the thing for me is that I thought the Beatles were in the 50s. I mean, I thought they were further back than they even were, because it just looked so ancient to me. Obviously I was so young that, 2 years before was ancient, so... But anyway, so that is the record. That is the record that started me on this lifelong journey of being a complete and utter dork about bands and records. But it wasn't just as far as the Beatles were concerned, it wasn't just the second album. Abbey Road and Let It Be were also in the house. And again, I don't really know who. I thought they were Vivian's. They may have been my Aunt Vivian. I think they may have belonged to my Aunt Vivian, but I'm not really sure. But those 2 were in the house, and those were 2 very early records that I was really obsessed with too. But that definitely came a little after the second album. And, obviously, as always with all these records, I would stare at the cover. I mean, I remember even as a little kid looking at the cover of Abbey Road and thinking it was so cool that the front cover was just a picture of them just walking across the street. No text, no grand concept, just a simple snapshot of these 4 guys walking across the street, and it just was so like, wow. It was just so novel, yet it was just so, it worked so well, and it just seemed so clever. And for some reason, I remember understanding that and thinking that as a child. But there were also other records around that in other households of my childhood. So that's the thing. I mean, when I was a kid, going to my grandparents' house on both sides, my mom's parents and my dad's parents, was something I did often. I did a lot of in my childhood. I did a lot of spending the night at Grandma and Grandpa's house, and that was because there were young people around. I had aunts and uncles who were young on both sides that I liked hanging out with. It gave me. I was the youngest kid in the family at the time, so it was kind of cool. It kind of felt like I had older sisters and older brothers, and they were really, they always had stuff to show me. Now, one of the records that we had in our apartment that I don't know who it belonged to. I don't think it belonged to my mom. It definitely didn't belong to my dad, because my dad, he wouldn't have had any records. It wasn't mine. It was just sort of there, was the Jackson 5 Christmas album. Yeah, and I don't know if maybe my mom may have picked it up at Woolworth or something, but yeah, it just seemed like it just sort of appeared, and then it just kind of vanished a little later on. But it was there in the early 70s, and I used to love to put it on. I loved Michael Jackson singing I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus, and God, what other songs were on that record? I haven't listened to that record actually since I was a child, but I loved it so much at the time. Now, come around 1973, there was an album that a lot of you who grew up in the 70s, especially in the early 70s, will probably remember, and it's an album called Dick Clark's 20 Years of Rock and Roll. And so I would say maybe sometime around late 73, early 1974, that popped up in our apartment, and I used to dig into it. I used to listen to it all the time. And the thing is that kind of appeared around the same time that Happy Days hit the TV, and we were watching that. I mean, I remember watching that from the very first season. I remember watching the early episodes when Fonzie didn't even have the leather jacket yet. Remember, he had the light blue windbreaker. I distinctly remember watching those episodes. And it was at that time that we had this Dick Clark 20 Years of Rock and Roll album. And so I kind of thought of it as the Happy Days record, because all the songs, or most of the songs on it, were 50s, and they were the kind of songs that you heard on Happy Days, Shaboom Shaboom and all that kind of stuff. But also it had Rock Around the Clock on it, which was the opening theme on that first season. And now I recall in for the Christmas of 1974, I told my parents what I really wanted for Christmas was the record that's on the cover, or not on the cover, was the record that is used on the opening credits of Happy Days. So yeah, I mean, you remember the opening credits of Happy Days when the jukebox record comes down and Rock Around the Clock begins, right? I wanted that record. And as a little kid, I didn't quite understand that wasn't really a real record. Rock Around the Clock was, but the one that I saw on the credits wasn't really like the real Rock Around the Clock record. And I also didn't understand that you couldn't just go to a record store and it wouldn't just be there, that it wasn't like a current thing. So I said that is what I want for Christmas. That is what I want. And come Christmas time, I did not get that record because my parents weren't really record savvy. They wouldn't have known anything about going to an oldies section or a used record store. And I think I got an electric race car set that didn't work, that my dad said, "Oh, okay, I'll return it and we'll get another one." And I never saw it again. An eternal mystery of childhood. But anyway, there was Rock Around the Clock on that Dick Clark record, and I remember it was the full version. The one on the TV was an edited version, and I didn't quite grasp that. I remember one night when Happy Days was coming on, I put on the record, the Dick Clark record, to play Rock Around the Clock at exactly the same time as the theme running, and they were gonna race. And of course the one on the TV won because it ended way earlier, because the one on the record was way longer. And I did not understand that at all. I didn't understand different edits, different mixes of things. I'm listening to it going, whoa, wait a minute, this is exactly the same recording. This is exactly the same thing, but there's extra stuff on this one, and it's longer. My little 3-year-old brain was just, I didn't know what that meant. But anyway, so yeah, one of the records that was also in the house at that time was the Rolling Stones' Between the Buttons. Yeah, we had a mono copy of that one. Yet another record that I don't know where it came from. I don't think it belonged to my mom. Like, I don't think she went to the store and bought that. Somebody may have given it to her. She may have just acquired it somehow. Definitely not my dad's. But for a while there, that record was just in the apartment, and I used to listen to it all the time. I loved Let's Spend the Night Together and Ruby Tuesday, and yeah, and I listened to the hell out of that album. That record brings me back to 1974 and brings me back to that time when Happy Days was in its first run. Now, another one that popped up that wasn't really... Yeah, a lot of these early records really aren't mine. It takes a little bit here before we get into records that I actually own myself, but not as long as you would think. I remember one day my grandpa Bertolino came home, and he said, "All right, I've been out to the bass," and he had bought a record. He decided he was going to buy a record that was just sort of a communal record that didn't belong to anybody in particular. It just belonged to the house, and he bought Neil Diamond's Greatest Hits. And it was it was like Grandpa was trying to be hip, but us kids, the older kids and even little me was kind of like, okay, all right, this is okay, I guess. And I'm looking at this cover, and again, I'm thinking it's 50s, because, Neil Diamond kind of looked a little 50s on that record, doesn't he? He looks more Elvis than Beatles, let's just put it that way. And so it all just looks so dated and just sort of like, I don't know about this, but I would put it on and I would listen to it. It had Cherry, and I kind of liked it, but I kind of didn't like it. But later on, of course, I ended up really getting into Neil Diamond, and because anybody who knows good music knows that Neil Diamond is good, but I didn't know that then. But that popped up, and let's see what else. Oh, here's another story of an early record, and this one actually was mine. Of my grandpa Bertolino, not having a clue. Well, I think it was my birthday. I think it was probably my birthday in maybe 73 or 74. Grandpa gave me a record. It was one of those things where the record's wrapped up. You know it's a record because, well, you know it's a record. And I was really excited, and I opened it up, and it was this weird Pickwick album called The Beatles, 1962 through 1970, played and sung by Kings Road. And I was like, what? Okay, wait, what? And my older, my aunts and uncles are like, oh yeah, it's the Beatles. Oh wait, no, it's Kings Road. Oh, it's this band that sounds just like the Beatles. And so so I'm looking at it, and it's kind of the Beatles, but it's kind of not. And my Aunt Jenny goes, oh well, let's go listen to it. Let's go into the bedroom where the record player was, and we'll play it. And I'm kind of going, I don't know. I kind of knew that this was some weird thing that wasn't really what it was supposed to be. And they put it on and put on the first song, and it's like, do you like this song? And I'm going, no. What? Okay, what about the next one? You like this one? No. What? Well, what about this one? And they went through all the songs, and I shook my head. I didn't like any of the songs. And they're like, it's the Beatles. I thought you liked the Beatles. And I'm thinking to myself, well, yeah, I like the Beatles, not this weird sort of sound-alike that doesn't really sound alike of the Beatles, but it sounds just like them. And I'm thinking, no, it doesn't. It sounds like somebody else doing some other randos playing Beatles songs, and that's all it was. And I'm just thinking, and all I could think was, well, Grandpa knows I like the Beatles, and he wanted to buy me a record. Why didn't he just buy me a Beatles record instead of this thing? And so that ended up being some lame record that I had for years and years that I ended up ultimately dumping, that I just sort of had. And, my grandpa probably paid 99 cents for it or something. It was probably a cutout, and that's probably why he bought that instead of an actual Beatles record. And, he thought the dumb 3-4-year-old kid wouldn't know a difference. But I knew the difference. I mean, come on, the cat would know the difference. Anyway. But, there were also some singles. There were some singles around that I really, really loved. And one of my very favorites from the time, well, it was actually from 1967, reissued in 1970, which was when it became a hit. But come around 73, 74, I was really, really, really a big fan. And that is Smokey and the Miracles' Tears of a Clown. And in fact, here's a picture right here of me proudly holding that single, and I just, this was during a family gathering, as you can see here. It's my great-grandma Bertolino there, and my sister, and, and my cousins and all that. But there I am, just holding on to that record, because that is all I care about. Yeah, even then. I don't know. I can't explain it. But yeah, so that was a big thing for me. And another single, and this one actually belonged to me, was Andy Kim's "Rock Me Gently." Yeah, that was an early record that was actually mine that I can recall. It and yeah, I really was. So that was one of my earliest favorite songs, was "Rock Me Gently," and another one from kind of around that same time that I really loved, that I think was my Uncle Dino's record, was the single for Ringo Starr's "No No" song, and yeah, I loved that as a kid. Not so much now. Okay, so then that takes us through like 73, 74. Now comes 75. That's when Elton John really came into my life. You know, I was aware of him, I think, a little bit before that, because he was all over the radio, and I knew I loved Rocket Man and, you know, all those great hits that were always being played on the radio. But come around late 74, early 75, that's when my Aunt Vivian she really got into Elton John, and she had the records. Like, she had the Greatest Hits album when it came out, and then the Captain Fantastic album came out. Now, when the Captain Fantastic album came out, that was definitely a turning point, because I remember she had one, but she also had the Someone Saved My Life Tonight single. I distinctly remember that being the new Elton John single, and absolutely loving it. And my Uncle Dino then got a copy of the album, and then I remember there was a day when Grandpa Bertolino took us out and took us to Montgomery Ward's, the record section at Montgomery Ward's, and he was going to buy us all records, and I got Captain Fantastic, and Captain Fantastic is the earliest album that I remember owning that was mine, that we got brand new at the store. My memory may be a little fuzzy. There may be something that's earlier, but that's the earliest one I remember. It goes neck and neck with the next one I'll mention. But yeah, this record was just, it was just so much to sink into. I mean, there was so much to look at on the cover. There were 2 booklets. There was a poster. I loved all the music on that record. My favorite song was "Gotta Get a Meal Ticket," but there was so much I didn't understand. Obviously, there was way too much in the cover for me to be able to wrap my brain around. But of course, lyrically, none of those songs meant anything to me. And that's the thing about early music for me, and I think I always have been more of a melody and sound and style kind of guy than a lyric guy, and I think that's because when I got into music, I was so young that I didn't understand lyrics, so they weren't important initially. I could listen to a song that I didn't really know what they were talking about, and it didn't matter. I mean, when you think about "Someone Saved My Life Tonight," I had no idea what that was about. None of that made sense to me. Like, one line to the next didn't even seem to have anything to do with one another, you know what I mean? And I didn't even understand what half the words were. Bring me down the line, you really should have been there. Like, that was just a mumble to me. But that was okay. You know, I still loved the music, and you know, and I think that kind of informs somewhat how I engage with music now, why I can listen to stuff that has really terrible lyrics sometimes and kind of forgive it. But the other album that kind of came around the same time that might have been my first one, but I think it was after Elton John, and that is this one, and I'm going to go grab it right now. Give me a second. Neil Sedaka, Sedaka's Back. Signed by Neil. Yes. Now, that record came out in late 74, and my Aunt Vivian had that, and I immediately just fell in love with that record. Laughter in the Rain was all over the radio, and I was a huge fan of that single, and I ended up falling in love with the whole record and ultimately getting my own copy of that album. And now this copy that I just showed you is not my childhood copy. In fact, I don't believe that I still have my childhood copies of any album I'm talking about today. Yeah, I don't think I actually... I mean, I have all of the records, but they're copies they're replacement copies that I got later. And this one, actually, the signed one, I actually got kind of recently. But yeah, Neil Sedaka's Back is probably that, and Captain Fantastic are 2 of the biggest albums of my early childhood. Those along with Beatles' second album. I mean, those are like the high watermarks for me, like the ones that I was most obsessed with in my early childhood. But yet, Elton John, of course, was one of my favorite artists of the entire decade. I mean, before I ended up really, really getting into Kiss later, I'd say Elton John was probably my favorite artist up till that point. Kind of Elton and the Beatles, but maybe even more Elton John than the Beatles, I think, early on. But, I remember when Rock of the Westies came out, and I remember being in Woolworths with my Aunt Patty when Rock of the Westies had just come out, and somehow, for some reason, we're walking through the store and we're talking about Elton John, and Patty mentions that she thinks Elton John is ugly. And this is just as we approach the record section at Woolworths, and right there where the new album end cap was a copy of, or were multiple copies of Rock of the Westies, and she pointed out that picture on the cover of Rock of the Westies and said, "See?" And I remember thinking, yeah, she's right, he is kind of ugly. But it wasn't too long after that the neighbor of my grandma and grandpa Bertolino's neighbor, Mike Narlow, who was the age of my aunts and uncles and a friend of theirs, he had Rock of the Westies, and he let me borrow it. And oh man, did I love that album. And that ended up being, honestly, I think I probably ended up loving that even more than Captain Fantastic. And I think it was kind of a while though before I had my own copy of that. But just the same, a copy of mine or not, that was a very big album of, from when I was around 5-6 years old. Now, another album that was a very early album that I actually owned myself was Tony Orlando and Dawn's He Don't Love You Like I Love You. Yeah, this is their 1975 album. Now, I remember being at the grocery store with my grandma, and we were at the checkout. We were in line for her to pay, and there was a little record bin right near the checkout, and I was like, ooh, records, and I went over and flipped through, and like right in the front was this Tony Orlando and Dawn album. And I loved Tony Orlando and Dawn. Grandma had a couple of Tony Orlando and Dawn albums, including the Greatest Hits album, which I was really obsessed with. But I had never seen this album, and it was, there they were, looking just like they do on the TV show. And I'm like, Grandma, can I have this album? Sure. She bought me the record. It was probably $3. And there you go. I took it home and pulled it out, and there's the little Electra label with the butterfly. First song, Morning Beautiful. And I was just like, wow. And I was so into it. And now that record, when I think about that record, I think about this period of time where we had a turntable at our apartment, and I had a few records of my own, Tony Orlando and Elton John and Neil Sedaka and all that kind of stuff. But I would, as a little kid, I would always break the needle, because I would just sit there and I would fuck with the record player all the time and mess with stuff, and I would break the needle. And my mom didn't have a lot of money. It's not like she just would go out and buy new needles every time. When I broke the needle, we would be out of commission, record-wise, for like who knows how long, months even. So it was always like a big deal when there was a new needle on the record player. It's like, oh my God, I can play records at home again. And yeah, I just remember there being long stretches of time with that Tony Orlando album where I couldn't play it because I didn't have a needle. Okay, but then we get into 1976, and when we get into 1976, that's when shit starts to get real. And, obviously there's stuff like Frampton Comes Alive. Now, that came out and obviously took the world by storm. And by this time, I'm 6 years old, and I got swept away in Frampton Comes Alive Mania 2, and actually was able to get my own copy of that, which is actually, when I think back to that, it was kind of remarkable, because that was a double album. And it probably wasn't that cheap. And the way I got this was that my Uncle Dick, one day I was at Grandma and Grandpa Bertolino's house, and Uncle Dick was over, and he said, "Hey, I'm going to give you some money, and what I want you to do is I want you to go buy a Fleetwood Mac album with it." And I'm kind of going, okay. I liked Fleetwood Mac, but I was like, okay. It just seemed like a really odd, and it was an odd thing, to grab the kid and be like, I'm giving you money to buy a record, I want you to buy a record, and this is what I want you to buy. I was like, okay. So when I went to my mom and said, hey, Uncle Dick gave me a record, or gave me money to buy a record, and I said, but I don't want to buy Fleetwood Mac. And she's like, well, buy what you want. You don't have to buy Fleetwood Mac. It's your money. He gave it to you. Buy whatever record you want. I said, okay, well, I want Frampton Comes Alive. And which I'm pretty sure was probably more than the amount of money Uncle Dick gave me, so my mom probably supplemented it a little bit. and that's how I got Frampton Comes Alive. But that's one of those albums that everybody and their mother had in the 70s, but I kind of remember, the way I remember it, I think I'm the only one who actually had that in the family. I don't think Uncle Dino had it. I don't think Vivian, my Aunt Patty. I don't think anybody else but me had that record. So strange, but what are you gonna do? So, and then, what else? Oh, another album of 1976 that I had was Captain and Tennille's Song of Joy. Yes, the second Captain and Tennille album. I think now my Aunt Patty by this point my Aunt Patty was getting into records and she had her stuff, and I think she had the first Captain and Tennille, and then I got the second one, and that was another one of those albums that I would have to go long stretches not listening to because the needle would always be broken. And but that was the one that had Shop Around and Muskrat Love, and yeah, I don't remember a lot of the songs on it now, but I loved it in 1976. What else was there? Oh, and there was another Neil Sedaka album that I was really big on, was the Steppin' Out album. Yeah, I remember getting that for birthday or Christmas in 76 from my grandma and grandpa Bertolino. I specifically asked for this one. And now what I didn't know is there had actually been an album in between Sedaka's Back and Steppin' Out, which was the Hungry Years album. But somehow that one got past me. I was unaware of that one. I remember seeing the cover, but I think because of the cover, something about the look of the cover, it just looked like it was an earlier album. I didn't realize it was a new album. So I actually never got that one as a kid. You know, but records were coming out so frequently back then, you know, sometimes you skipped one over. And, well, that brings us to the big moment in late 1976 when I discovered Kiss. And, well, it was at that very Woolworth that I keep talking about when I was in the record section of Woolworth's, and I saw Destroyer, and I didn't know what it was. I was just looking at the cover, and I didn't even know what I was seeing. I didn't know who were these freaks on this cover. I didn't know they were wearing makeup. I thought they were just like circus freaks or something. Like they were these four guys who found each other who all just happened to have the same deformity. And I didn't realize that it was a painting. I thought it was a real photo. And they just looked like these weird monsters. And I didn't know... Yeah, I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew I was interested. And I just kind of put it back on the shelf and just made a mental note. And then after, you know, all the other kids started talking about Kiss, and then they showed up on TV on the Paul Lynde Halloween special, which I watched. And at this point, I've decided I must have a Kiss album. So when my birthday rolled around that year, you know, the Halloween special was in October, my birthday's in December, so I said I want a Kiss album. And, well, of course, what I meant by I want a Kiss album was I wanted that Kiss album, because that's the only one I knew of. So on my birthday, my dad said, here you go, here's your Kiss, you know, here's your album. And I opened it up, and it was Rock and Roll Over. Well, see, Rock and Roll Over had just come out in November, and when they went to go buy me a Kiss album, the guy at the store said, well, here, this is the newest one, you should get this one, this is the one that just came out, so they bought that one. But now, the cool thing is that my dad's girlfriend, my parents were divorced at this time, my dad's girlfriend had Destroyer, and she didn't want it. She goes, oh, here, I have this one, do you want this? Because she had bought it because Beth was on it, and she didn't like any of the rest of the record. So, boom. Right there in one shot, I got Destroyer and Rock and Roll Over on the same day. Completely set. And that was it. A Kiss fan was born. Now another big... Oh man, this was a huge 1976 album for me. And another one that, amazingly, I was able to get my own copy of because it cannot have been a cheap record. And that is Wings Over America. Oh man, I remember when that came out, and I remember when they played... Yeah, I remember when they came around and played on that tour. And that was just such a huge record for me. I you know, maybe I'm amazed. The live version of that, I was completely obsessed with that track. And now that's a triple album. I really don't know if somebody in the comments can tell me, because maybe you know, what did that record retail for in 1976? Because I've always wondered. And somehow somebody bought that thing for me, and I had it. And man, I just would go through that whole damn thing and stare at the picture on the inside gatefold. And I was doing a lot of staring at records as a kid. I still do. But yeah, so 76 gives way to 1977. And, well, a whole new obsession. Sean Cassidy. Yeah, that's right. Sean Cassidy's first album came out. The Do Run Run was all over the radio. And I had my Aunt Patty and my Aunt Vivian, like an older aunts who were the right age to really get into this stuff and be buying these records, and I was along for the ride. I thought Sean Cassidy was the coolest, and ultimately, and I ended up getting my own copy of that first Sean Cassidy, and then that same year, later the same year, the second album, Born Late, came out. Yeah, and I had both of those records, and I was so into Sean Cassidy. Like, now we're getting into an era when I'm starting to want to be the artist, you know what I mean? I used to fantasize about being Sean Cassidy and like being in the Hardy Boys, and yeah, you know, Sean Cassidy was in Tiger Beat and he was in 16 and all those magazines, which I was buying, which I was mainly buying because Kiss was in 16 every single month, you know, but also Sean Cassidy and also the Bee Gees, and because of course in 1977 we have the classic, the Unavoidable Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. Man, talk about a gargantuous, huge monster of a record from that time, and in my own personal history of records, I couldn't have been more obsessed with that, kind of like everybody else, right? And I mean, you know, I remember that record. That record actually preceded the movie. I mean, it was a hit before the movie came out, because I remember going to see the movie right when it came out, and I already knew and had the record. So, you know, that whole little thing was done very cleverly, wasn't it? But, yeah, Saturday Night Fever, and then, of course, by 1978, you had Grease, which was the next John Travolta film. And, you know, I didn't actually get the Grease soundtrack when it was new. That was one of those records that everybody else had. My cousins had it, my aunts had it, but I don't really remember really getting my own copy until much, much later. But also, it was one of those records that you kind of didn't have to have, because, well, like I said, everybody I knew had one, so I always had access to one to listen to. But, you know, of course, also in 1978 was Kiss's Double Platinum album, which I remember there being a television commercial for, and the solo albums, which came out in September of 78. Now, those were a huge thing. I remember those were just like a dream, like, oh my god. And that was 4 albums. How the hell was I ever going to get all 4 of those? Now, I remember the first one I got was Gene. And I think my mom may have bought me the Gene one. I don't remember if it was a birthday or... Well, no, because it would have been late 78. Well, I don't know. All I know is that I got Gene pretty soon after those came out. And then, that's right, and then come my birthday in 78, my dad got me the Ace solo album. And then I got Peter next, and then I got Paul last, but those were probably more like early to mid 79 when I got those. And, yeah. I mean, what a phenomenon those were. I'm like, every kid on the block had to have one, right? And, but, you know, anyway, I could go on and on about all this stuff, but now we're starting to get into like all the rock albums that I started getting really obsessed with, and then this leads right into the 80s, and I'm not going to talk about the 80s. In fact, yeah, it's just all about the 70s. You know, there were so many records that I didn't talk about. There's some that I've forgotten. You know, ones that slipped through the cracks, like A Star Is Born soundtrack. I didn't talk about that. I'm not going to now at this point. But yeah, I don't really know what the point was of this video, or if it was of any interest to anybody. But I just felt like doing something that was a little different from my usual videos, and this is it. And well, if you didn't like this one, that's okay, because the next one will probably be something you're more used to. Maybe a track versus track, maybe a ranking, maybe a fantasy album. I do have one of those on deck, but I have to finish the details on that before I can make that video. But anyway, you know, if you like any of my videos, if you want to see any more of my videos, and you want to know where they come out, subscribe. Click the little bell when you subscribe. You know, comment and like and all that good stuff. And let me know what some of your really early albums are. I mean, how early in life did you get into music? And what was your first album? And what are the earliest records that you owned, or the ones that you were obsessed with? And yeah, I mean, I can't have been the only kid who was ridiculously obsessed with records at a stupidly young age. I mean, you know, the 70s records were so important that I think a lot of kids were probably really into music very young. And I bet you're one of them. Let me know. That's it for this video, and you know, I'll see you next time. Man, I don't know about this video, man. Gonna take a lot of editing. A whole lot of editing. This has potential to be really terrible.